Hello, everybody. My name is David Carney. I'm the Executive Director of the Career Industry Council of Australia. Welcome to the third webinar in our Empowering Futures series. Before we get underway today, I'd just like to make an acknowledgement of country. So the Career Industry Council of Australia would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connection to land, sea and community. I'd like to acknowledge that today I'm hosting this webinar on the lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us in the session today. Just a little bit of housekeeping, just to let you know this session is being recorded. If you experience any technical issues over the course of the presentation, please, in the first instance, just try refreshing your screen. If that doesn't work, please just log out and come back in with the link that you've been provided. As always, we've got the chat function open today, so feel free to add your comments or contributions to the chat. But as always, our presenter today, Franco, will be focusing on his presentation, not keeping an eye on the chat. So if you do have any specific questions, please put those into the Q&A. And if we have time at the end of the session, we will endeavour to get those answered for you. As I said, this is the third out of four. We have one webinar left in the series next week, Enhancing DEI Strategies, What Career Practitioners Can Do. Again, this is also free. If you're interested in attending that event, that is next Wednesday, the 26th, at the same time, 2 p.m. Eastern Australian time, you can either click on that QR code or visit the Seeker webpage, click on the Events tab and register to attend. So it's enough of the housekeeping. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome Dr. Franco Dispenza to our series. Franco is a tenured research professor of counselling and psychology at Georgia State University in Atlanta, Georgia. He specialises in the psychosocial and vocational dimensions of chronic illness, disability, and LGBTQI plus identities. He has a master's in rehab counselling and a PhD in counselling psychology. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Franco to the series. I'm going to stop sharing the screen and hand over to Franco.
Thank you so much. Let me just give me one moment to get this presentation going, which means I need to stop sharing my screen, then I need to reshare my screen. So just give me one moment, folks. Excellent. So thank you, David, for the warm welcome, and thank you for having me join. So presentation today is Affirming the Work-Life Interface for LGBTQ Individuals. As David said, my name is Franco. To also do an land acknowledgement here, I am in the state of Georgia here in the United States, which is also Cherokee Nation, or rather history of Cherokee Nation. So wanted to make sure I also acknowledge that. So to kind of get into this, wanted to first start with some objectives. And there are really three major ones that I wanted to make sure that I mentioned beforehand, because I'm actually kind of going out of sequence for this presentation. The first is really exploring the influence of legislation and some organizational policies, some of the behavioral economics, which I'll admit is a little bit outside of my field as a psychologist and a counselor, but very much has a lot of implications when we think about the work-life interface for LGBTQ individuals. After that, I want to discuss some of the aspects around career development, particularly some of the unique contextual factors that influence LGBTQ populations when it comes to work. And that also means starting with some aspects that impact LGBTQ youth when it comes to career and schooling, and sometimes how that coincides with career and work. And then hopefully definitely within the hour, I promise I want to talk to you a little bit more about minority stress theory, how that is used in vocational psychology as well as counseling, but also some mental health aspects, because I know that there is a wide range of folks from different backgrounds and experiences. So I'm trying to take a bit of a survey on this topic, providing some level of breadth while also giving some implications that could hopefully help improve your practices and help you provide better affirmative practices and care to the people and the communities that you serve. With that being said, I believe it's always important to begin with some positionality, as well as my approach to this. And so, for those of you who may not be familiar with the term positionality, it is a term that we use a lot in social science and education research. And the idea here is that there are aspects of a person's social identities that very much contribute to their understanding of the world. And so, there are five that I typically want to share with all of you. And those include the fact that I am Sicilian American, Sicilian American heritage of the United States, here in the United States. My mother and father emigrated to the United States in the 1970s. And so I grew up in the United States being the child of immigrants who were also both in working class individuals. My father was a construction and brick mason. My mother was someone who worked in clothing factories and then later on worked with on school buses for children with disabilities. So definitely their experiences have had a big impact on my own life, of course. I'm also taking in the perspective that I'm from the global north, right? I've been trained, I've lived in the United States my entire life, and so I recognize that being in the global north definitely has some influences in terms of my interpretations and understanding of the world, and that definitely differs from the global south. So that's also just an area of growth that I'm trying to expand on and be better at when I'm communicating and reaching out to other audiences. Another thing that I'm sharing, and that's actually something I'm sharing a little bit more recently, I'm also a student of rhetoric, formal rhetoric, classical rhetoric, as well as some contemporary rhetoric, and it very much has influenced the way, without knowing it until more recently, it definitely has influenced my frameworks for organizing and expressing ideas. I'm definitely expanding to better understand global rhetoric, but definitely has implications for how I approach science and epistemology as well as clinical practice. As David mentioned, I am a counseling psychologist and a rehabilitation counselor, which means I've been formally educated in these arenas. And so with that comes the values of those professions that I hold really dear, including multiculturalism, including social justice. As a rehabilitation counselor, one of my first initial trainings was to work with people with disabilities, particularly in the area of career and work and vocational placement. So the world of work and folks with diverse identities was definitely something that was always really important to me, meaningful, and has very much shaped my career up to this point. And that, of course, includes my LGBTQ and my disability scholarship, which also means that sometimes I have to go outside of counseling and psychology to understand what's happening and better make sense of that world. Um, so it's definitely my positionality, some of my positionalities and my approach to this presentation. As an American, though, I also need to admit that I would be remiss if I did not share this with an audience, particularly an audience that's in Australia. And that is, as someone who enjoys traveling, I also like to think of myself as someone with a palate. This is something I've been sharing with David. Unlike some of my American contemporaries, I actually do like Vegemite, and I actually enjoy it on sourdough toast with butter. And as I was sharing with David before, I probably have too many of these in my own household when it comes to Tim Tams, and it probably explains why I also sometimes have to go to the gym twice a day to work off the calories. But I'm very excited. This is probably my favorite part of the presentation today, is I get to share with people who can relate to this, because most of my American friends and colleagues don't really necessarily share these sentiments and feelings with me. So thank you for indulging me as I share this with you. All right, back to the reason why we're here. So, uh, so let's begin a little bit with this policies, economics, the business management side of things when it comes to working with LGBTQ persons. And one of the things that I've come across from over the years, as well as what I've seen in the scholarship over the years, is that definitely scholars have been more interested in understanding how LGBT inclusion is related to economic development as well as business management, but also how government policies around LGBTQ individuals and communities impact economy and economics. And so one of the things that comes along with that yes, is what I consider some of these fundamental propositions, right? And this is really a fundamental proposition that comes along with a lot of diversity, equity and inclusion sentiments and feelings and matters. And the idea here is that inclusive workplaces, and we know this, and I hope that most of you would also likely agree that inclusive workplaces yield substantial benefits, including cost savings, increased productivity, enhanced staff retention. And then whereas workplace discrimination restricts the talent pool, we understand that inclusive policies contribute to, of course, a diverse workforce, which then drives innovation and strategic decision making. And so the way I oftentimes think about this is I think about what it means to build a house. And so I'm thinking about my father when I think about these fundamental propositions. Of course, like I said, he was a mason, and there was a lot my father can do when it came to building, right? Setting up frames, putting up concrete, putting up brick walls, putting up sheetrock. And as a kid, I had to help him, on weekends when he had little side projects. And the idea here is that uh, there are a lot of talents that one person probably has and can do. However, my father also recognized early on in his life that he couldn't build an entire house. He still needed other individuals with other strengths and skills and expertise, right? He couldn't do the plumbing, he couldn't do the electrical work. Definitely design was not one of his areas of strength, right? So the same proposition applies when we think about business economics, when we think about the world of work, and that is when we embrace the skill sets of a diverse workforce, it means we're able to build stronger houses, to utilize that metaphor. And so I think the same definitely applies to LGBTQ rights and what happens when we're able to bring in a workforce that's also inclusive of LGBTQ populations and communities. Uh, so this one particular study that I want to talk about, and I'm actually going to talk about the study in great detail, but it's one from 2019 that has had quite a profound impact in the way that I think about government policies. And what we understand, and the study I'm referring to is Badgett et al. 2019. And so what we understand is that when a country adds legal protections for LGBTQ individuals, the research shows that the gross domestic product per capita, right, the GDP goes up about $2,000. Now, for those of you in the audience who are not familiar with GDP or gross domestic product, that's basically the total value of goods and services that are produced in a country over a specific period of time. I would say think about it as being how much money each person in a country could theoretically have. And so when we think about this particular finding and what Badgett and their team did was look across 132 countries combined to get this number, they were able to find that, yeah, there is this association between the number of legal protections that LGBTQ individuals have and the economic good of the country. It's like basically getting a bonus payment for being inclusive. And so to put this in perspective, when I try to explain this to younger folks, some high school folks, not necessarily about this, but really what it means to have protections or legal protections, I sometimes use the metaphors of gaming, right? When you upgrade your character's abilities, for those of you that are gamers or have children or have young adults in your life who are gamers, right? Every time you add some sort of protection, particularly an LGBTQ protection, you actually unlock some new levels to boost your character. And so that same principle applies when you think about it from an economic perspective. There are also some regional differences that I think are worth noting. And so what the researchers found was that uh, there are different patterns across the world, as would make sense since labor markets and economies change across different parts of the world. And so East Asia and the Pacific, which was inclusive of Australia, New Zealand, and that region of the world, what they found was when each new legal protection was added to a country, it increased the GDP by about $1,800. And then in Europe, it was about European Union rather, just looking at European countries. And at the time of the research, it did include the UK. It was 480, and then Europe and Central Asia was about $641. And so I share this because these differences tell us that while inclusion is generally helpful and helps economies grow, the impact can definitely vary depending on local conditions. And uh, I like to bring this up, and I'll explain this. I'll mention this again a little bit later. It gives us an important sense of what the data tells us about legal protections, government rights, or rather what governments do to help protect their populations and their communities and the impact that it has on the economy. Now, a business perspective is also really important. And so, a study that I found that went into some detail about this did actually, this was in relation to Australia. And what they found was when there was more acceptance of LGBTQ workers in the workplace, they found that it led to about a $285 million $285 million in savings. And that was the result of an increase of 11% of staff retention, right? So that was staff that they didn't have to rehire or new because they were able to retain staff and workers. And then also an increase in 30% when it came to productivity. So I found this actually quite interesting, but I will share that this is a study that they were referring to back that was collected back in 2015. So it is about 10 years old. I couldn't find anything more recent than that, but I'm sure there are figures and numbers that are out there. The other thing that I found really interesting out of the Hussein et al. 2020 study was they looked at corporate equality index. And what they found was that when companies score higher on the corporate equality index, and I should say that the corporate equality index is like a report card of how well companies treat LGBTQ employees. And so what they found was that markers of innovation and creativity also increased. And so innovation here is being measured by analyzing how much spending is being done when it comes to research and development, the number of patents filed, the number of new product launches, market share gains. And so there are a number of things that go into calculating what they mean by innovation. But what they found was that for every standard improvement in their grade, innovation went up by 0.38%. Now, some of you are like, that's not really a high percentage. And I would probably agree that in the social sciences, not the highest number, but when we're thinking about larger scale economic types of things, this number is still significant. And it's really demonstrating that even small improvements in innovation can lead to some big advantages for companies. So there's definitely something of value that's worth mentioning here when we think about, again, rights, how companies treat their LGBTQ employees, and the benefits that companies and corporations and even countries are able to gain from this. Another thing that I came across, which I of course found interesting, was that about 85% of Fortune 500 businesses, particularly those in the United States, have explicit policies against LGBTQ discrimination, or rather against sexual orientation discrimination. About 49% include gender. And so what I found interesting about this is that whereas prior studies have found that various forms of diversity are associated with greater innovation, we're also finding that there is some specific attention to LGBTQ individuals, and it continues to show it going in the right direction. And so I very much think of this as sports teams, right? You want the best people on your team. When you have the best people on your team, you get some better outcomes. Now, the other thing that came along with some of this research was looking at investors. And so this is where we see some mixed findings. However, what we do know is that, of course, investors who are interested in inclusive rights definitely are more likely to invest more in companies when there are um, better policies around equity and inclusion, especially even those with LGBTQ inclusive policies. Of course, those who don't support such policies withdraw their investments. So this is where there's definitely some mixed findings, but again, showing some trends that I think are important and interesting to share. So what are some practical implications? When I think about this, some of the things that come to mind is that the research is important because it challenges some old ideas that being socially progressive or inclusive uh, and being economically successful are somehow at odds with each other. And really, the data is not necessarily showing that. It's definitely showing that there is an association, there is a relationship. Of course, I can't necessarily prove causality, as many of these models and statistical models are tend to just look at these variables from an associative perspective. But it's definitely showing that there's some strong relationship. The data is there and it justifies it. Companies can also expect some real economic benefits from implementing anti-discrimination policies, including investment in diversity policies that can be justified not just ethically, but also financially. And so that's definitely something worth noting. Uh, and I'm just going to move this along a little bit because I'm being mindful of time, and I have definitely some other slides I want to share with you. But I think another thing that comes up is what are some of uh, the implications for policy. And so one of the things that I found over and over in this area of scholarship and research, and even in consultation with some colleagues, is that when policymakers are thinking about implementing this, really, they very much advocate for a phased approach to policy implementation, as the research shows that the benefits tend to accumulate over time. So this means starting with basic non-discrimination protections, gradually expanding to be more comprehensive in the rights that could be offered to workers. And then with that, developing the mechanisms that measure those economic impacts, which is why they tend to advocate for a slow progression and implementation process. So again, the key takeaway here for policymakers and for those that have an interest in that is that there is evidence that justifies the importance for inclusive policies while also offering some concrete metrics for measuring that success, especially if there are any researchers in the room that are interested in this, or those of you who are just thinking about how else this data could be used to justify some decisions that we end up making. So to shift gears a little bit, I want to now go from that macro level of economics. And part of the reason why I also wanted to start with that is one of the things that you'll see in a little bit in this presentation is that there is a lot of I don't want to say doom and gloom, but there is a lot when we talk about in terms of discrimination, in terms of negative experiences. And those are very much the experiences of the LGBTQ community. Definitely, it's been my experience clinically and in my own research, but there is also a lot of data and also a lot of good stories and narratives that are important to share that they're and optimistic data and hopeful data. And so I wanted to start with that just to kind of get us to this point where the world of LGBTQ youth and the world of work has also changed a lot in the last 20 years that I've been in this field looking at this. And I think it's important to uh, make sure that we have a bit of a balanced perspective when we think about what that world of work looks like. Uh, and so one of the things that I should share with all of you is a couple of years back, I was the co-chair for the task force on for the American Psychological Association, where we helped refine and redevelop the guidelines for psychological practice with sexual minority individuals, which include lesbian, gay, bisexual, plurisexual individuals. And with that, we made sure that we continue to focus on education and work of LGBT individuals, recognizing that those two systems are really intricately connected. And so, what we know from that scholarship when we were preparing the guidelines, and these were guidelines that also influence and inform clinical practice as well as research practice, what we found in the data is that, of course, we know that there is considerable victimization, harassment, bullying, cyberbullying that's happening. And we know that those experiences for LGBTQ youth definitely impacts their grade point average. When we think about that, it influences higher rates of absenteeism from school. Unfortunately, LGBT youth will withdraw from extracurricular activities. They're twice as likely not to pursue post-secondary education. So we know that there are some deleterious consequences of that experience. And then the other thing that we see is that there is, of course, discrimination. And then one of the things that we tend to find in the scholarship and even in experiences when we meet with youth, or rather when I've met with youth and talked with them about their experiences, is that there tends to be this constraint around stereotypical career expectations that further restrict vocational choices, and sometimes leading LGBTQ youth to choose safe career paths, right? Versus limiting career paths or going into some what we refer to as non-traditional career paths. So there's definitely some stuff that happens here as a result of that. I think that another thing that we continue to see, and I've definitely seen this in my own clinical experiences as well as working with students who are working with LGBT youth is that there is a lack of visible LGBT role models, which further complicates the career guidance piece or career counseling for that matter, leaving, I think, LGBT youth um, with sometimes a lack of resources, or rather looking toward the adults for that guidance. But even the adults sometimes don't even necessarily know where to go. I would say that in the more recent years in this area, one of the conversations that I'm continuing to see that I'm actually happy to see is that there are also good things that are happening during this period of time. And so we do see the development of more positive self-concepts, definitely identity acceptance. That definitely is also having impact on on career planning and vocational outcomes. So we're definitely seeing that. But with that, one of the things that has been around for quite some time is something that we refer to as the bottleneck effect or the bottleneck hypothesis for LGBTQ youth. Now, this is something that's been around since the 1990s, and it's continuously been researched in some shape or form. And for those of you not familiar with the bottleneck hypothesis, it basically holds that while LGBTQ youth are simultaneously navigating their sexual and gender identity, they're also going through regular social developmental processes, including career development processes, right? The idea here, though, is that because there is a significant amount of stress and stigma associated with sexual and gender minority identity formation, the idea here is that there's a bottleneck. It constrains what happens when we think about career development processes during this time. And really when I'm thinking about age, I'm really thinking about that 12 to 22 year uh, span of time. A lot of my work when I worked in a college counseling center, working with college students, definitely saw how some of those constraints happened. What I also saw was more clinical presentation of anxiety and depression along with that. For my colleagues who are school counselors and work in the schools, they're not necessarily seeing so much the clinical piece, but they're definitely commenting that there's more some delays in terms of career interests, what they can do, what they can't do. And it makes sense because right now they're focusing a lot of their energy on an aspect of their identity that maybe they're still discovering and figuring out. Maybe they haven't quite disclosed it yet, or it's not safe to disclose. So there are a number of key issues that they need to contend with that those who are not LGBT don't necessarily have to when we think about this. And so what we see from, at least from the research side of things, is that when these constraints are happening, when there's some type of stigma and or stress or identity conflict, we're definitely finding that LGBTQ youth are scoring lower on their sense of vocational purpose, and they're also scoring higher when it comes to career indecision. Uh, Now, what's been emerging more recently, and again, something that I'm happy to see, and I'm glad that my scholars are looking into this and seeing this, but I'm also seeing it when I'm supervising students who are working in schools. They're definitely seeing more protective factors, or at least I should say maybe we're more aware and conscientious of what are the protective factors against these bottleneck effects. And so we're finding that, of course, when LGBTQ youth and emerging adults are thinking about are engaged with social supports, it protects against it. When there's more practice around self-compassion, particularly around stigma, there are protective factors against it. Also, when there's more authentic identity development, there's again, more protection against that bottleneck effect. I think the other thing is that social media has definitely also changed the type of access that we have to LGBTQ material, including positive messaging, as well as just general media when we think about cultural media, television and movies, and the normative pieces of that, and seeing normal, healthy relationships, I think is also playing a role. And then more recently, Morris and Length, and for those of you that are looking at the Length name and maybe thinking to yourselves the social cognitive career theory, and that is that Length. More recently, they looked at college students, and what they found was, and I'll read this verbatim just so I don't butcher it. Sexual minority college students, LGBTQ in particular, who exhibited more sexual identity integration, reported stronger decisional self-efficacy and support, higher levels of career decidedness, and in lower levels of decisional anxiety. So, so we're definitely seeing some movement and changes happening in this area that I think warrants a lot of attention and definitely has a lot of implications, especially for those of you who are school counselors or those of you who are working with college students in your field of work. So now, what are some pragmatic clinical implications for practice? The first, of course, is you want to create and enforce anti-bullying policies that address LGBTQ discrimination. We understand that when there's a positive school climate, that can reduce the fear of discrimination for those students, which otherwise, without it, would impede their performance and career exploration. Definitely also thinking about offering spaces for LGBTQ students that can openly discuss their experiences and challenges, such as support groups. I led a number of them when I used to work over at a college counseling center. And there are a number of student support groups even today that are happening within colleges, within outside colleges. I will say I should preface this, and I know some of you are probably thinking, but there's a lot changing right now in the United States, and that is true. There are messages that we are getting regularly and daily from the current Trump administration that is changing these things. Um, and I'll happy to engage some thoughts in that afterwards. But we do know that the data and the clinical practice, when we think about what we have been doing, that's been effective and helpful. And so I can't not share that with you as being the current recommended standards of practice. Exposing students to LGBTQ professionals across a variety of fields. And I think, again, with the advent of social media and what's available, I think we probably have more opportunities to expose students to LGBTQ professionals and seeing what's normative out in the workplace. Of course, there's always the opportunity for extracurricular resources that include historical figures and professionals, and reinforcing that LGBTQ individuals can succeed in any field. I think that's an important component here, especially for those of you that are working with, that adolescent age when they're trying to get a better sense of what's out there for them. And then, of course, career-specific resources, mentorship opportunities, networking groups, job shadowing, and I would say all the typical stuff that any of us do when we think about just general career development processes still apply for this group. It's really more a matter of how do we make this slightly more responsive for those youth. Uh, the building the networks piece is always a really key part here. And so for those of you that are doing that, thank you. Please continue to do that because our data, whether it's looking at career, whether it's looking at academic achievement, whether it's looking at mental health functioning, continues to find that social support, whether it's through family, friends, online social support avenues, other interest groups, whatever those can also be wonderful sources. We also understand that those could also be sources of stress. So those need to always be monitored for those of you that are working with this group using that modality or using that as a potential intervention. So, always be attentive to that. And then, of course, one thing that the data that also supports is teaching students strategies for self-compassion and resilience, and emphasizing that career and identity development are evolving processes, right? And those don't just stop. They definitely have a longer term effects. But we do find that, particularly when it comes to fostering self-compassion, that it does help reduce a lot of anxiety around career decisions. So that's one of the reasons why it's advocated for. All right. Next, I want to move on to workplace organization. And here I'm thinking about most of the scholarship and most of the clinical work done in this area. Most of my colleagues who do work in this area tend to think of the adult worker, right? The person that maybe is post university or vocational schools, or maybe didn't, but they're 30 in their 30s and 40s, and they're definitely working. And there are definitely some implications for them in this place. Now, I mentioned before the doom and gloom, which typically the doom and gloom is the negative experiences and discrimination and the disparities that come along with it. The scholarship is quite extensive when it comes to workplace discrimination. And what you'll see oftentimes in the scholarship and what gets talked about, but even when I think about some of um, just personal friends of mine and colleagues of mine, as well as even those of clients, is we tend to see discrimination happening in these two particular types of arenas. There's this formal discrimination that unfortunately happens, and that's when there's prejudice and discrimination or that happens in during the job application process, during the interview process, when people are going up for promotion or review, employment termination, things like that. So that's where it gets clumped under that formal discrimination experience. Informal discrimination refers to discriminatory incidents on an interpersonal level. And so this may relate to malicious jokes, snubs, harassment. When we talk about these kind of subtle forms of discrimination or microaggressions that occur, jokes that don't land well and kind of build up over time and then have people really thinking what someone meant by certain things like this. And what we understand from this area of scholarship and what we understand continuously that there are some antecedents to this. Religiosity plays a role when when employers invoke religion as one of the reasons to discriminate. It definitely becomes problematic. The issue, of course, is that not all religions, even the same religion, doesn't is not accepting of that discrimination. So there's definitely a lot of tension there. Definitely beliefs in traditional gender roles. And one of the things that I haven't done, which I recognize would be an entirely different presentation, really, is that there's a lot of conflating when it comes to sexual orientation and gender. And unfortunately, you see this time and time again when there's policies. Of course, I think, again, those of you who are all aware of what's happening here in the United States, not to bring it back to me, but again, it's where I live and it's what we're going through when President Trump um, signed an executive order defining gender. That was, of course, quite problematic, as you can imagine. My friends over in the biology department, of course, had a lot of concerns about that because it's not aligned with what they believe as biology scholars and researchers when we think about genetics. Um, the other problem here is this notion that there's some aspect of controllability around gender and being gay. And that is something that contributes to this type of discrimination. Interestingly enough, previous contact with LGBTQ individuals has a profound effect. So those who have had contact or maybe, have family members or friends, we find that they, for some reason, all of a sudden totally are incredibly affirming, as one would expect. Versus those who have had little to no contact actually tend to report more discriminatory attitudes. So we know that that contact piece plays a crucial role. Another finding, which unfortunately is still the case, but I haven't looked this up in a while, or haven't seen any new data, is that there are some wage disparities. And what we find, and this has been something that's been consistent probably for the last 2 decades, is that rather gay and bisexual men are more likely to earn less than their heterosexual counterparts. And so some of this is believed to be the result of that bottleneck effect, right? The constraining, the types of experiences that individuals may have, the type of rather how much schooling and education they could possibly get to that then leads or lends itself to some types of employment or even higher skilled jobs that may be viewed as very masculine or too masculine and or maybe potentially more discriminatory that keeps certain members out. Versus for women, rather, when we think about lesbian women or bisexual, rather lesbian women, this is not something that we find. Actually, in some instances, what we're finding is that lesbian women or sexual minority women are actually outpacing their heterosexual counterparts. And sometimes some of the thoughts about this may be related to the that gender division that typically happens in households when it's a heterosexual pairing isn't necessarily happening in gay and lesbian relationships, and so that could potentially be playing a role. But it's not conclusive data. But again, the data does show that there are some disparities that are worth exploring and looking into when it comes to the world of work. Another big thing to think about, which this has been a growing body of literature for quite some time, is identity management. And so LGBTQ persons definitely employ various identity management strategies when they're in the world of work or in even school. And that means that they're thinking about how do they disclose? Do they disclose? And the first thing that I have, the first panel on this screen is that really it's a double-edged sword. And so I cite Chung et al. 2009. It's a bit of an outdated study. This was actually one of the very first studies I was an author on, so that's why I have this here. Barry Chung was an advisor of mine, a wonderful mentor who's now a dean and a fellow of of course, a fellow of the American Psychological Association, and taught me a lot. But one of the things that we noted was increased authenticity definitely increases well-being. So being out in the workplace means you're more authentic, can increase some level of well-being. But unfortunately, being out in the workplace also does increase stress. It does increase the risk of job loss, and unfortunately, it does increase the risk of workplace discrimination. One of the studies that I remember at this time that had come out that had some profound effect in this part of the vocational psychology world was they had collected salivary cortisol levels of gay men, those who were out at work and those who were not. And so despite that those being out at work subjectively reported having much better experiences and being more satisfied with their job, their stress hormone levels were just as high as those who were not out at work, right? And so this was an interesting finding because basically the physiological data, particularly stress level data, doesn't necessarily change if you're out or not out, but the subjective experience does change. So this definitely has some pretty profound impact when we think about what stress does to the body and to the mind and how it's managed. But one of the things that's been talked a lot about is the different identity management strategies that people will use. And so people possibly come out at work, but due to just wanting to be honest and live with a sense of integrity, the desire to have closer relationships with their coworkers, or to, even educate and advocate for LGBT issues. But we know that's not always the case. And so there are 5 particular types of management strategies that are used. Now, I'm not advocating for any one strategy. There is research that looks at the advantages and disadvantages of these strategies, and we recognize that they are highly context dependent. And so the first strategy is acting, or it's referred to as acting. So that's just behaviorally portraying as oneself as heterosexual, but it's an implicit one. Versus the passing or counterfeiting is when someone actively constructs a heterosexual identity or fabricates information, altering the name of their spouse, altering pronouns. And so, literally, one of my best friends whose first husband worked in the IT world, um, you know, my best friend all of a sudden was a woman, had a feminized version of his name as their name, and for years his husband worked in his now ex-husband, which maybe explains why they're exes. Uh, um, why that was the case, rather, and why rather um, felt the need to have to do that in the place of work that he was in order to make sure that he can keep that level of work and not lose his job. Covering or avoidance is carefully controlling the amount of information disclosed to coworkers that may reveal one's orientation or gender identity. Being implicitly out is behaving in an honest manner, but without labeling oneself as LGBT, and then explicitly out as someone who's openly identifying and sharing those aspects. And so what we find, and what I've definitely found in scholarship and even in my own research, is that people are definitely navigating these particular types of management strategies in some shape or form. Deciding which strategies to use definitely depends on one's internal psychological processes, right? There's a cost-benefit analysis of the possible consequences of disclosure, as I mentioned, as well as what the environmental supports are for that individual. So this is where that work-life interface piece really comes into play. And what we understand also is that when someone um, definitely has more affirming attitudes about their sexual and gender identity. When someone has a they've centralized their identities, right? They feel good, they feel secure, and definitely know that it's an important element of them. They are more likely to disclose and be comfortable in being explicitly out. Where we know that in some of the research, those who are not as affirming of their identities, those who have more anxiety around this, those who uh, maybe prioritize other identities, sometimes they find that it's less relevant to their work, and they're less likely to come out. In some instances, they're also more likely to report not being satisfied or happy with their level of work. So we see that also in the research.
Franco,
Uh,
sorry to interrupt you. Can you just
sure.
click your mouse again? Because that slide is sort of, that's it,
Stuck.
perfect. Yeah, it
Perfect.
just got stuck. Thank you.
Okay, let me go back to this one. Can we see that?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, perfect. Yep. And then so those were the identity management strategies. And then there's coping that comes along with that. And so one of the things that we found in this study, which we've continuously found in other studies, is that there is pretty much three different types of coping strategies that people are using. Again, I want to emphasize that for for clinicians in the room that are maybe working with folks in this area, this is not a point to advocate for one type of identity management style or one type of coping. This is really just a matter of understanding that these are what people are doing typically. And so there is utility in some of these strategies that are at least worth exploring, right? So these become kind of the areas that make up the counseling process, especially from a career context. And so what we find when it comes to coping is that there are three typical types, right? There's this non-assertion piece, right? This is the person who may quit their job, the person who's silent at their job. They avoid, the people or the sources of discrimination or the sources that may be negatively impacting them. Sometimes we may see is the individual who's overcompensating by working harder. And so sometimes I've seen that as a kind of a non-assertive or a non-assertion when it comes to managing identity and managing some of the stress related to their identities at work. There's also the social support piece, right? Which is they're seeking out the emotional and social support of their friends and their colleagues and their spouses and their friends and their family members and even other coworkers or professional mentors, right? And that helps. And then sometimes there's the direct confrontation of discrimination, right? Which is addressing the various parties, taking legal action, or circumventing some policies. So this definitely makes up that piece of identity management that I think very much comes up for LGBTQ individuals in the workplace. Now, with that being said, what I just talked about really relates to the individual. And again, I think implications for those of you who may be working with individuals, whether it's in a counseling context or even, a human resources context, or maybe you're teaching this to some of your students, for those of you that are professors or university, college counseling center educators like I am. But there are implications also for management and organizations to think about. The first is implementing some leadership practices that enforce policies that foster inclusive work environment for LGBT employees. And so, but part of that is also just anyone that's managing in a workplace. Obviously, for those of you who are managers, you're protecting the well-being of all your employees, right? And all the folks that work for you. And so definitely wanting to make sure that there's equity and fairness for all individuals really goes also a long way, I think, in this context. And definitely, even in the absence of policies or legislation, ensuring that employers are treated equally, regardless of their sexual orientation, I think becomes really good practice and important practice from a leadership perspective. Utilizing multiple voice mechanisms, organizations can adopt some various methods, whether it's through, anonymous feedback channels, inclusive diversity councils or leadership teams. Um, Making sure that you're integrating diverse individuals in that decision making becomes also really important. But providing employees opportunities to express satisfaction as well as areas of improvement could help contribute to workplace improvements. Now, this is a controversial one, diversity training. I have it on there, one, because Ozera in 2014 that did a number of systematic reviews on this topic found that overall, the studies that looked at diversity training did find it to be effective and helpful. So I would be remiss if I didn't share that with all of you as being a potential implication. Although, again, diversity, equity, and inclusion related trainings are right now being highly targeted here in the United States as of recently. So we'll see what this means. But again, the data shows that it has been effective. And then, of course, the continuing to leverage economic and marketing benefits and sharing how the data justifies why these are good practices for companies. All right, the last piece, and I'm go as quickly as I possibly can on this one because this is the stuff I can really talk about for quite some time, is the minority stress model. And for those of you who, I hope that there are those of you who are familiar with it. For those who aren't, this is, I would say, is probably the predominant psychological model that's been used within the last 10 to 15 years to understand what's happening for LGBTQ individuals. It was originally looked at for mental health related stuff, but of course, there have been myself and my colleagues who have been looking at it in the context of career and work. And so the idea here is that because there are environmental factors, oppressive factors that influence um, LGBT individuals. And what I mean by those factors, I'm talking about cisgenderism, cisnormativity, heteronormativity. What ends up happening is that becomes internalized by individuals. And we refer to that as proximal minority stressors, right? And so this is where LGBT individuals internalize the internalized homophobia, they internalize rejection, they internalize this need to have to conceal their identities. And that's sometimes the result of the potential threat of distal minority stressors. And those include actual, moments of discrimination and harassment and violence, and the social messaging that it's not okay, which right now we're starting to get here in the United States from our own government. And so we know that this has quite a significant impact, but we also know that there are mediation variables, which is the Hudson-Buehler psychological mediation piece that transmits certain effects between one variable to another. And so what this does is that we understand that these minority stressors, these proximal stressors, and these distal stressors are also mediated by, I'm trying to think, emotional regulation, positive cognitive processes, social functioning or social supports. And so we know that not every single LGBT individual that experiences this type of stress is coming out as depressed or indecisive when it comes to their career. So we understand that there are these mediational mechanisms that work and function and help buffer some of those effects. And definitely this becomes an area of further exploration. And so for those that are clinicians that are working in the room or providing career counseling or just any sort of career intervention work, definitely one of the things I want you to do is always think about how do you assess, how do you do this in a clinical interview, how do you appraise experiences of prejudice, microaggressions, rejection, expectations. These become the avenues, the specific things to examine and look at in a counseling context. And see how it's impacting career, how it's impacting work, and trying to make those connections with clients. Also trying to understand the level of emotional regulation or dysregulation, if there's maladaptive coping, any negative cognitive processes like low self-esteem or pessimism, what someone's social support system is like. Again, these become areas that need to be examined and looked at in a counseling context that could then become the focal points of treatment and intervention. Another thing that I promote and that I really much talk a lot about, and this is something that I published back in 2016 when I was a young assistant professor, was career counselors really should focus on enhancing career adaptability by helping clients, again, develop those coping skills, those aspects of resilience, self-empowerment. And again, you're normally doing this after thinking about um, what are those minority stressors that are potentially impacting them and can you bolster some of their adaptability and augment some of those stressors and maybe buffer them in a particular way that they're able to continue to seek meaningful experiences when it comes to work, career, and their well-being. And then, of course, those coping strategies, which include vocational choice models, identity management piece that I talked about, how they're managing discrimination in the workplace. Those all become important considerations. Lastly, because the title of this presentation was affirmative intervention, is affirmative practices mean something, and that is understanding that LGBTQ identities are normative, right? And so normally when we think about practice, we're as clinicians and as those of us that are, even if we're not clinicians, we're just, we're managers and we're working in these settings, we want to provide encouragement and support and pride and resilience. And we want to support all of our employees, as well as we want to support all of those in the workplace. It's also not pathologizing behavior and affection expressed by LGBTQ persons. What I find so interesting when I go back and I read the literature from from the 1980s, from the 1990s, is how much this rhetoric of please stop pathologizing, how much of that existed, because there was a lot of that was happening. Versus when I think about some newer clinicians I've been seeing and training, and I'm talking about real young folks, this is something that's really foreign to them because they don't necessarily come from an experience where they were pathologized or feeling pathologized. So we know that times have also changed. But when we think about those affirmative practices, it definitely started out of not wanting to pathologize. Acquiring and utilizing accurate knowledge, right, which was part of the impetus for this presentation. And then, of course, wanting to continue to promote anti-LGBT attitudes, right? And so being resistant to the messaging that continues to stigmatize and pathologize LGBTQ individuals when it comes up. And so that these are all elements of what it means to be affirmative. All right, those are my references. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. And David, I know there may be some questions. Hopefully I can answer them. I know we're almost at time, but I wanted to, again, provide as much breadth around this topic, as well as some implications with the hopes that some of you got something out of this that could actually uh, impact your training, impact your work, and impact your own interventions with folks.
Thank you, Franco. You managed to cover a lot of ground in a short period of time, so you did well. There are some questions in the Q&A. You should be able to see those at the bottom.
Sure. You feel So take the first one from Margie. Also, it'd be great for students could feel confident and comfortable who they are before making career decisions. Unfortunately, they often have to make career decisions before they have that confidence. Well, okay. I hope I answered that. So this is a hard one, right? Because we know that for students, career development process is also an ongoing process. The other thing is the world of work is also changing. So we're also in a really interesting time where when I'm thinking about the impact that, for instance, AI is having, there are a lot of changes that are going to be happening that are really going to impact how we also help continue providing hope for our LGBTQ clients, but also all of our clients. Are LGBTQ people overall more reluctant to seek promotions to training once they are in the workforce? I can't say that I've ever seen anything in the data to support that they're more reluctant or less reluctant. The psychologist in me is more likely to say that those may be some personality factors unique to the individual. But again, you're also factoring in what the labor market and what the particular region has that may impact how someone does that. Okay, questions are really coming in real quickly. Are there any models that are co-made with unions? Much of this is workplace safety. I'm glad you brought that up. So when I talked about my own upbringing, definitely, my only context for unions is really what I have here in the United States. I'm in a state here in the United States. Georgia is a right to work state, so unions are kind of a dirty word. Versus New York, where I'm from and where I grew up, unions were everyone was in a union, everyone was in a trade association. So I'm not as familiar with that aspect of what's happening, and that I think has a lot to do with the region of the United States that I'm in. But that's a really good question. I wish I had an answer, but now I'm curious by that. Okay. What other questions? Is that all of it?
Can you see there's one more there from Bella? Can you see that one?
Bella. Also, are there any models that are coming with unions? Much of that is the workplace safety. Yeah, no, that just answered that one.
See,
Is there
they
one that's
shed one.
okay.
Have you got
Have
any?
you yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, have you got any data on HR management and coming out as trans at work? Many of my colleagues have been misnamed and misgendered by HR on official documents, but have had better experiences with their specific work team. This one's a hard one because they're um I so far of the data I've seen, it tends to look at again identity management stuff. Again, it's really more about work safety, and then a lot of it is the legal component, the legal protections, is what I'm noticing in at least what's being talked about. Even when I go on certain um, online social posts of what's happening and what people are kind of sharing, because here in the U.S. it changes state by state, which is unfortunate because the federal the federal regulations have been slowly scaled back. Um, so no, I wish I had more for you, but I don't.
You've done very well. You've got through the question, so well done.
Thank you. Thank you.
It just gives me an opportunity now to thank you. A really important, contribution to our series. I think, sometimes, we don't place enough emphasis on this, and not everybody, is either working with or working in a situation where they may be, coming across LGBTIQ plus people. Um, and I think obviously, there's been significant progress made here in Australia, but we can see by your own experience how quickly things can change and can get wound back. So I think
Mhm.
that's probably also something for us to keep our eyes on. We have an election coming up in the first half of this year as well. So, and at the moment, our current government is in a bit of trouble, and potentially we have a conservative government that may be formed, but they might have different views. So, um, thank you very much again for your time. It is 11 o'clock in the evening your time now. Please don't eat any more of those Tim Tams. You don't need
Uh,
sugar at 11 o'clock at night. Thank you for staying up and for presenting. It's been great. So thank you.
yes, it was a pleasure. Thank you all for having me, and best of luck. And I'm excited to hear more that may come out of that may come out of your future in the world in Australia, and wish me luck in mine, for that matter. Yeah,
We'll keep an eye on it for you.
appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Franco. Good night.
Yep.
Bye bye.